Good morning, everyone. My name is Mary Chris Ada, and I am here to discuss the topic syntax, sentences, and their structure. We're going to discuss today sentence types, major constituents of sentences, and phrase structure rules. Our objectives for today is to define syntax, to understand why we study syntax, to discuss the sentence types, to examine the major constituents of sentences, and to understand phrase structure rules. So, what is syntax? Syntax is the part of grammar that governs the organization of words in phrases and sentences. It is the structure of sentences and their relationship to one another, both structurally and functionally. It is the arrangement of words in sentences, clauses, and phrases, and the study of the formation of sentences and the relationship of their component parts. So, let's take a look at the two example sentences. Which sentence below is more comprehensive? Order words make sense need to. And sentence B says, words need order to make sense. Obviously, we can say that example B is more comprehensive because of its structure. Why do we study syntax? There are about 5 reasons why we study syntax. First is we must study syntax to understand how children acquire their language, how they start constructing sentences, and what stage do they learn the tacit syntactic rules of language. Second, it is also good to study syntax so we can understand how bilingual and multilingual speakers are able to construct their sentences despite having different structures for different languages. Third, studying syntax gives us many answers which are necessary for understanding how languages work, as well as being the doorway to future research and theories on all aspects of linguistics. Fourth, we also study syntax to develop set rules and constraints on the language which are called parameters. And lastly, syntax helps with a number of linguistic fields such as semantics, language acquisition, conversation analysis, discourse analysis, morphology, and pragmatics. Now, let's discuss the sentence structure. We have 3 types of sentence structure. The first one is simple sentence, which consists of a single clause that contains a single verb or predicate, or that stands alone as its own sentence. For example, Dan washed the dishes. A runner from Nigeria won the Olympics this year. The people should have believed in the vaccines. All 3 sentences have singular verb, so they are considered as simple sentences. Let's look at the tree diagram of a simple sentence. Sue liked Casper. Sue is the noun, liked is the verb, and Casper is the direct object. In sentence 2, Sally said it. Sally is the noun, said is the verb, and it as the direct object. Later on, we're going to discuss more about direct objects. Let's go to coordinate sentences, or known as compound sentences in traditional grammar. Coordinate sentences consist of two clauses joined together to make coordinate sentence by coordinating conjunctions such as and, or but. For example, Kenneth assembled the new grill and Joe cooked the dinner. These are two simple sentences combined together, which makes it coordinate sentences. The second example is Demi bought a new Honda motorcycle, but she doesn't drive it very often. We can see here the first sentence is Demi bought a new Honda motorcycle, and the second sentence is she doesn't drive it very often. You will see here the conjunctions and but that combines the two sentences together. In the first and second examples. Let me show you a tree diagram of a coordinate sentence. Let's move on to complex sentence. Complex sentence combines two or more clauses in such a way that one clause functions as a grammatical part of the other one. Embedded clauses are the clauses that can be incorporated to another clause. For example, Sue said, then wash the dishes. The embedded clause is then wash the dishes. In the second example, that the runner from Nigeria won the Olympics surprised many. The underlined sentence or clause is the embedded clause. Let me show you a tree diagram of a complex sentence. Now, you will see here in figure number 2, Sally said she saw a ghost. And in figure number 3, the sentence says, Sally said it. Notice that a complex sentence can transform to a simple sentence when we replace sentence or subordinate sentence in figure 2 with the pronoun it on figure 3. When a clause is embedded into another clause, it is often introduced by a subordinator. Subordinators serve to mark the beginning of an embedded clause, and they help identify the function in the sentence. Take note that not all embedded clauses must be introduced by a subordinator. For example, Helen said that Ben washed the dishes. We can rather say, Helen said Ben washed the dishes. And the third example says that he won surprised many. That he won is the subject and surprised is the verb. However, if we remove the subordinator that and we just simply indicate he won surprised many, it will not make a good sentence. Now, the form of embedded clause says when a clause is embedded within a certain other clause, its form may differ from the form it would have if it stood independently as a simple sentence. For example, Sue said Dan washed the dishes. And sentence B says, Sue wanted Dan to wash the dishes. These are two different sentences with different thoughts. Notice that in sentence 2, Dan to wash the dishes is what we call a an independent a dependent clause, because it will not make a good structure sentence if it wasn't connected to the first clause, Sue wanted. Let's give some more examples. On the first column, we have here the sentence, Sue said Dan washed the dishes. Now, if we transform that sentence into Sue said Dan to wash the dishes, it will not make a good structure sentence. However, if we say Sue said Dan will wash the dishes is an acceptable structure of a sentence. Same goes with Sue said Dan washes the dishes. Now let's take a look at the second column or column. Sue wanted Dan to wash the dishes. If we're going to transform that sentence to Sue wanted Dan washed the dishes, or Sue wanted Dan will wash the dishes, or Sue wanted Dan washes the dishes, these sentences are not well structured English sentences. Take note that the form of an embedded clause can depend on a particular verb of the clause in which it is embedded. Now, let's move on to some sentence key points or sentence structure key points. The first one says coordinate sentences contain clauses of equal status. And that's in the example, Kenneth assembled the new grill and Joe cooked the dinner. This sentence contains equal status because Kenneth assembled the new grill is an independent sentence combined with the other sentence, Joe cooked the dinner. Now, the second sentence structure key point says complex sentences contain sentences of unequal status. One clause is subordinate to another clause and functions as a grammatical part of that clause. For example, Sue wanted Dan to wash the dishes. The subordinate clause, Dan to wash the dishes, is a dependent clause to the first clause, Sue wanted. Now, the third key point says subordinate clause are called embedded clause, and the clause to which it is embedded is called matrix clause. Let's take a look at the example. Sue wanted Dan to wash the dishes. The matrix here is Sue wanted, and the subordinate clause is Dan to wash the dishes. Every subordinate clause is by definition embedded in a matrix clause in which it serves as a grammatical function such as subject, direct object, or adverbial. Let's take a look at the example. Sally said she saw a ghost. The underlined word she saw a ghost is a direct object. Now, we can replace that clause with the pronoun it. So we can simply say Sally said it, and that's the direct object, it as the direct object. Now, let's take a look at example number 3. That Nigel refused to take the vaccines upset Jen. The underlined clause is the subject, and we can replace the underlined clause with the pronoun it. It upset Jen as the subject. It as the subject. Now, every subordinate clause is by definition embedded in a matrix clause in which it serves as a grammatical function such as subject, direct object, or adverbial. Now, the next example here is an example of an adverbial clause or adverbial object or modifier. So, Joe cooked the dinner after Kenneth assembled the new grill. The underlined clause is the adverbial modifier, which we can replace with the adverbial modifier then. We can rather say Joe cooked the dinner then. Now, let's move on to the major constituents of sentences. Sentences or clauses consist of smaller structural units called constituents. There are two basic constituent parts in sentences and clauses: the noun phrase and the verb phrase. The noun phrase contains the nouns or pronouns, and the verb phrase contains verb or verbs. Let's take a look at the example given. Alex swims. Alex is the noun phrase and swims is the verb phrase. Same goes with Tom won. Tom is the noun or the noun phrase, and won is the verb phrase. Now, we can see in this diagram some more examples of sentences. Now, we can notice that the first sentence is just a simplified sentence, but we can expand the sentence by adding some more elements in the sentence, such as determiners or adjectives or adverbs. Now, bracketing is an alternative tool in representing constituent structure, as illustrated below. So that's the same way of writing the previous illustration shown. A noun phrase or noun phrases functions as movable units in syntactic processes, no matter how long they are, especially in cases of passivization. Now, we can notice right here in the first sentence, Zelda auctioned the famous wooden spoon. Zelda is the subject and the famous wooden spoon as the direct object. We can interchange them and just simply say the famous wooden spoon was auctioned by Zelda. And let's have the third example. The LTO officer fined an old man from Gamay. We can say an old man from Gamay was fined by the LTO officer. Or the next example here says, Anna's brother crushed the tablet I gave her. And we can write it too. The tablet I gave her was crushed. crushed by her brother. The tablet I gave Anna was crushed by her brother. Now, this diagram shows in simple illustration the two major constituents of a sentence or a clause. So, a sentence or a clause contains a noun phrase and a verb phrase. Now, let's move to phrase structure rules. One way of representing various noun phrase patterns is by the use of phrase structure rules. There are 5 phrase structure rules for rewriting a noun phrase. The first one says that a noun phrase contains nouns such as elixir, oracle, patience, saucer. Now, the second rule for rewriting a noun phrase says that a noun phrase has determiner and a noun. For example, the elixir, an oracle, some patience, a saucer. The underlined words are the determiners. The third rule for rewriting a noun phrase says that a noun phrase has determiner plus an adjective plus a noun. For example, we can say a flying saucer or some sick patients or an ancient oracle. Now, let's move on to the fourth rule of rewriting a noun phrase. Note that determiner is not always required in all 3 rules, so as adjectives. Thus, these 3 rules can be collapsed into a single rule if we adopt the convention of placing parentheses around optional elements. So the collapsed or abbreviated rule will look like this. A noun phrase contains an optional determiner plus an optional adjective plus a noun. Now, let's move on to the 5th rule for rewriting a noun phrase. Because determiner and adjectives are each optional, we can rewrite the noun phrase not only as in rule A, B, and C, but also as follows. A noun phrase contains adjective and noun or plus noun. For example, supernatural beings or extraterrestrial life or great imagination. Now, if there are well-formed noun phrase structures that contains of an adjective and a noun, then the rule is valid. Otherwise, a noun phrase needs revision to exclude structures that are not well-formed. Now, we will move on to the second phrase structure rules, or the rules for rewriting verb phrase. Similar to the rules of rewriting the noun phrase, verb phrase has the following rules. The first one says a verb phrase contains verb. For example, Tom jogged. The underlined word is the verb phrase. The second one indicates that a verb phrase can contain a verb plus a noun phrase. For example, Tom won a bicycle. So the underlined words are the verb phrase, which contains a verb plus a noun phrase. The verb is won and a bicycle is the noun phrase. Now, the third rule for rewriting a verb phrase indicates that a verb phrase can contain verb plus noun phrase plus prepositional phrase. For example, Tom won the bike in May. The underlined words are the verb phrase. Won is the verb, the bike is the noun phrase, and in May is the prepositional phrase. So PP stands for prepositional phrase, which contains a preposition and a noun phrase. Now, a prepositional phrase contains a preposition plus a noun phrase. For example, from Canada, to his brother, or in May. And the fourth rule for rewriting a verb phrase indicates that uh, a verb phrase may or may not have a noun phrase and a prepositional phrase. For example, Tom won. The optional phrase here is the bike and in May. So instead, when we make a sentence, Tom won the bike in May, we can rather say Tom won, because the noun phrase and the prepositional phrase in sentence number 2 are optional. We can also say Tom won the bike, or we can rather say Tom won in May. And those sentences can stand as a simple or independent sentence. Now, the last rule for rewriting a verb phrase indicates that a verb phrase can contain verb plus an optional prepositional phrase. For example, we can say, Jane swam in the pool. We can rather say Jane swam, and in the pool is just an optional prepositional phrase. That means the sentence Jane swam can stand alone even without the prepositional phrase. And that's the same for Alex ran around the track and she flew to Canada. Now, to summarize the phrase structure rules, let's take a look at the diagram below. There are 4 basic rules in phrase structure rules. The first one says a sentence contains 2 constituents, the noun phrase and the verb phrase. And the second rule indicates that a noun phrase contains noun with an optional determiner and adjectives. And the third rule indicates that a verb phrase contains verb with an optional noun phrase and prepositional phrase. And lastly, a prepositional phrase contains a preposition plus a noun phrase. Now, let's take a look at the phrase structure rule tree diagram in this sentence. The tall runner won a prize at the race. Now, this sentence contains a noun phrase and a verb phrase. The noun phrase is the tall runner, and the verb phrase is the won a prize at the race. Now, if we take a look at the noun phrase in this sentence, it has a determiner, an adjective, and a noun. and the determiner is the, and the adjective is tall, and the noun is the runner. For the verb phrase, we can see here that this sentence contains, or the verb phrase in this sentence contains the verb, the noun phrase, and the prepositional phrase. And the verb is won, the noun phrase is a prize, and the prepositional phrase is at the race. Now let's elaborate further the noun phrase under the verb phrase. The noun phrase has a determiner and a noun, and the determiner is a, and the noun phrase is prize. Now for the prepositional phrase, which contains a preposition and a noun phrase, at is the preposition and the noun phrase contains the determiner and the noun. The determiner is the, and the noun is the race. Okay, so here is the tree diagram of that particular sentence. Now, the phrase structure rules is very important, especially in determining which one is the subject or the direct object in a sentence. In English, the subject is defined as the the subject is defined as the noun phrase dominated by the sentence or in the sentence, and the verb or the direct object is defined as the noun phrase that is immediately dominated by the verb phrase. To elaborate further how we can understand which one is the subject and which one is the direct object in a sentence, let me show you this diagram. So in a particular sentence, we said that the subject in the sentence is directly dominated by the noun phrase the uh, in the noun directly dominated in the noun phrase in a sentence, and the direct object is directly dominated by the um, verb phrase. So take note that a noun phrase is an optional element in the expansion of the verb phrase. So not every sentence will have a noun phrase directly dominated by the verb phrase. That means not every sentence has direct object, especially in the case of intransitive verbs such as die, hurry, talk. And sometimes the verb functions transitive or intransitively. So if we take a look at these example sentences of the verbs on the first column and the second column, we can see right here the transitive verbs like on the left, on the right column, or on the left column, Casper won a prize, and we can just simply say Casper won, or Margie sings lullabies, or we can just simply say Margie sings. Now for intransitive verbs, scream, we cannot put other determiners on the first column for transitive verbs. So we can just simply say The child screamed, or Grendel died. So they are intransitive verb. They do not require direct objects. Now, what is grammatical relations? So the subject and direct object are functions known as the grammatical relations. So beside the subject and the direct object, languages can have a grammatical relation such as indirect object, oblique, or the object of a preposition, and a possessor, for example, Joanne's car. In English, there is a disagreement about the status of indirect object as a grammatical relation. There is a debate whether the English language has indirect object. For example, the witch offered the child a potion. And the other sentence is, the witch offered a potion to the child. So we can transform the second sentence to a simplified one. The witch offered the child a potion. Now, next is that the syntactic properties of the child differ in these two sentences. So this changing the active voice into a passive voice in the sentence may not be the same for the second sentence. So that's all for my report today, and my references are these. And that's all. Thank you. Have a good day.